Well, we've done it. We finally escaped Macross 7 Purgatory. And for as much as I love that series, I'm honestly kind of relieved. Not only is this just a new topic, but it's been one I've been excited to delve into since I started this retrospective. If you're one of those poor souls who endured my shitty ranking video, you'd remember how harsh I was towards Zero in specific. Hell, even more recently, I threw a dig towards it in my Flashback 2012 retrospective, and I don't really remember why. I think part of my distaste simply came from how much I was in love with 7. I love the high-energy rock and roll music, the crazy over-the-top fights with sound energy lasers and speaker pods, and how genuine and uplifting it was with its message. It was a story about perseverance, Basara's journey as an artist to make his mark on the world. But Macross Zero went for a completely different route, instead being a darker story about war, and more specifically how war can destroy culture just as easily as we can create it. But despite this, I wanted to give it another chance, because not only did I just not remember anything about it, but my reasons for not liking it just kinda felt wrong. I dismissed it for being different, but isn't every Macross sequel different? 7's nothing like Plus, and neither of them are like SDF, which I guess that's like 2, but we don't talk about that one. So why did I single out Zero? Was I simply just too stubborn to move away from Macross 7? Was I just that eager to get to Macross Frontier? Regardless of what it was, for this retrospective, I'm completely clearing my head. We're gonna learn to look at Macross Zero for what it is, and to do that, we need to figure out what it actually is. We're now entering the 2000s, with Macross finally wrapping up its longest running entry yet. Since it was the 20th anniversary of the series creator Shoji Kawamori and his team began thinking up ways to celebrate, with them eventually landing on the idea of a 5-episode OVA series that would serve as the next entry. Or should I say, the first entry. As the title would imply, Macross Zero is actually a prequel to SDF, which is admittedly a weird idea. The thing that sets Macross apart from other mecha anime is the idol aspect. But Minmay was the first instance of humanity actually using an idol to stop a threat. This means that Macross Zero would be the first and only series to omit the idol aspect altogether. Kind of. There's still music, but we'll touch on that later. Instead of singing to aliens, this series aimed to explain the Unification Wars. The Unification Wars were a series of conflicts fought amongst the UN government and the anti-UN government, being briefly mentioned multiple times throughout the original series. However, at some point through production, Kawamori decided to tone down on the military aspects a bit. Not only did 9/11 make these subject matters a bit more touchy, but around the time he'd begun developing a fascination with nature after working on a series called Earth Maiden Arjuna. The series would lean a bit more to mythical elements, as well as exploring humanity's connection to nature. As for why nothing in this supposed prequel gets mentioned in the original series, Kawamori said the story depicted in Macross Zero is one the UN government tried to bury. As for the production team this time around, it was mostly an entirely new lineup. Mikimoto began his Macross vacation, with the designs instead being done by Takuya Saito. And music was done by Kumini Kagejima, who I can't find on Google without finding some Haikyuu character, but he did the soundtrack for Monster, so that's cool. Anyways, with the production out of the way, I think it's time we delve into Macross Zero itself and figure out what the fuck it was even about. Our main character is a pilot named Shin Kudo, who isn't as flashy as Basara, but hey, we gotta keep an open mind. He's reminiscing about the horrors of war in the midst of a CG animated dogfight that still looks impressive to this day. Seriously, Kawamori has been trying to push for CGI since Macross Plus back in 1995. He doesn't view it as some cheap cost-cutting measure. He is genuinely passionate about the medium, and I honestly respect it. Whether or not people like to admit it, 3D animation genuinely does have its benefits, with the most obvious being the ability to take the camera wherever you want it. And let me tell you, Macross 0 takes advantage of it. This shit came out in 2002, it has no reason looking this good. Anyways, since Valkyries still aren't a common thing at this point in the timeline, Shin's caught off guard when an enemy is using one. Both him and his comrade Edgar are blasted down to the surface, where he soon wakes up in an unknown area severely injured. He finds a wooden spear to defend himself and takes note of a strange bird-like statue looming above him. After heading outside, he encounters a group of people, specifically Mayan people. One of the Mayans introduces herself as the Holy Wind, and tells him to leave this island at once, as he's a blood-stained individual who will taint the purity of the island. Obviously referring to the fact that he's a soldier who's probably killed people. However, the Holy Wind's young sister, a girl named Mao Nome, steps in to defend him. She points out how he's still bleeding, and if the blood seeps into the ocean, it might attract evil spiritual entities known as the Kadun. The girl finally lays off and is properly introduced as Sarah Nome, but Shin doesn't care, he just wants off this island. He begins looking for Edgar, who might have washed ashore, but all he finds is broken Valkyrie parts, making him realize that, he probably didn't survive. Cutting to a UN government laboratory, we see a scientist named Ares Turner giving a presentation. They recently uncovered a bird-like structure located underneath the Mayan island. It's a relic that predates the Mayans themselves, leading her to believe it might have been left behind by extraterrestrial beings, similar to the SDF Macross that have recently crashed onto Earth. After the presentation, she goes on her break, where she's greeted by none other than Macross fan favorite Roy Fokker. That's right, they actually brought Roy back for this, and while I'm not as big of a fan of Roy as most, it's always nice to have returning characters. And I think he's one who deserved more screen time. Maybe I'll grow some more appreciation for him. Back at the Mayan island, we get really chill scenes of Shin trying to assimilate into their lifestyle, as Mao expresses interest in the outside world. It's a nice little back and forth, and while walking, Shin finally decides to ask her about the bird-like structures scattered about the island. She explains that it derives from the legend of the Birdman, which immediately made me think of Gabble, but unfortunately it has nothing to do with him. Sorry, Gabros. The Birdman was believed to be an entity that traveled the cosmos, leaving behind a big turtle that would soon become the very island they stood on. Shin also notes how the Birdman resembles the fighter jets he pilots, which surely isn't foreshadowing. While gazing out into the distance, Shin notices a nearby satellite tied to an electrical generator, which Mao says has been out of service for a while due to a storm. He begins trying to fix it in the hopes that he could bring some electricity to their island. But while doing so, he notices a man in the distance giving a wooden spear to another woman, which Mao explains is a love profession on their island. Remembering that's exactly what he did to Sarah, he begins laughing, which is honestly a relief, because I thought they were going to do a quirky anime joke where he starts blushing, be like, what? But no, it's a cute scene. You know, Mao points out that this is the first time she's heard him laugh, and he gets weirdly dark for some reason. He's just like, because there's nothing to laugh about. None of this is good, Mao. That's why it's called war. Speaking of war, it's about to hit the island, as anti-UN soldiers are being sent to the Mayan island. So, in retaliation, the UN government deploys a squadron led by Roy, who's set to pilot the first ever UN variable fighter, the VF-0. That night, we see a bit of conflict between Mao and Sarah, as Sarah wants to avoid any contact with the outside world in fear of their peace being ruined, but Mao wants to learn about and embrace the world beyond the confines of their island. While Sarah might come off like a hard-ass, she genuinely is trying to act in the interest of her people. Something Shin himself goes on to acknowledge, as he later decides to help her craft some quote-unquote love sticks, It's honestly a really wholesome scene. I like their dynamic. Strict, mean girl and goofy, fun-loving guy, that's just a dynamic I dig. The wholesomeness doesn't last too long though, as Sarah's somehow hit with a premonition from the underground Birdman structure, implying she has some sort of connection to it. Anyways, this premonition is triggered by the arrival of Roy's squad and the anti-UN forces, who begin having a violent duel right above the island. Remembering Mao went off alone to fetch some water, Shin navigates the collapsing island to save her as Sarah works to evacuate the people. The episode ending with Sarah revealing one part of the Birdman legend Mao left untold. Once the Birdman returns, destruction lies in its wake. Very strong first episode. There was good visuals, intriguing lore, and I liked all the characters. Maybe I was stupid and Macross Zero is actually good. Episode 2 picks back up with the dogfight between Roy's squad and the anti-UN forces. Shin eventually finds Mao, but before they can make their escape, a Valkyrie crashes right beside them. The sight of the soldier dying triggers flashbacks for Shin, remembering how the anti-UN forces supposedly gunned down his family. Overrun with anger and hate, Shin hops into the Valkyrie himself and begins firing at the enemies, albeit very clumsily since Valkyries are still a new thing. Once Roy catches wind of this, he comes down to provide backup, with the two eventually fending off the enemies and Shin leaving the island to return to base. While all this was going down, Sarah was praying for the protection of her people, as her and the old man discussed the Birdman legend in more depth. The Birdman supposedly severed its head, something that aligns with the artifact the UN forces pulled from underneath the island, which they point out seems to be missing its head. Which, if you didn't piece it together by now, it's the Birdman's remains. Couldn't happen to Gabble, he kept his head throughout the series. Back at the base, Shin discovers that his partner Edgar actually didn't die, even though he crashed into the ocean. I guess he must have used the ancient Gamlan survival technique. Roy decides to recruit them into his squadron, with the two co-piloting the VF-0 for themselves. This leads us into a paintball training montage in the vein of Macross Plus, with yet again stellar visuals. But Shin loses, he's a bum. Feeling let down over his loss, a drunken Roy tries cheering him up by deploying him on a super special mission, which is basically just acting as a bodyguard for Ares as she explores the Mayan island. Something that annoys him at first, but he lets off once he sees Sarah again. She lets Ares and the soldiers on the island, but only with the promise that they leave their weapons behind, as again, she really wants to keep her people out of war. Remembering his promise to Mao, Shin begins to repair the generator with her yet again, with Sarah watching them from the distance because, yeah, it's Macross, we need a love triangle. Ares begins asking random people for blood tests, which Sarah understandably finds pretty weird. Shin and Mao try defending it, but I don't care, I'm with Sarah here. And not just because it does go against the Mayan code, but I'm not trusting anyone who sits on a beach collecting blood. Is she even qualified to do this? She's an anthropologist, not a fucking medical doctor. And worst of all, she bribes them into doing it with, like, Prime in G Fuel. What is her problem?
Go fuck a sea urchin.
Anyways, Shin finally fixes the generator and brings electricity to the island, which pisses off Sarah. She says that the lights are stealing away the starlight, and she's right. We get a scene in which anti-UN pilot Nora takes part in dastardly schemes to steal the Birdman and destroy the UN soldiers. You'd think she'd have a bigger role throughout this OVA, but she really doesn't. But hey, we get a really nice scene of Ares on the phone with Roy as they reminisce on their college experiences. I'm glad this series is making an effort to develop Roy some more. I find myself caring about him more than I did in the original. And to cap off this episode, we get a really beautiful scene where Shin discovers Sarah singing a song called Archon, which frankly is the best song in this entire OVA. As she sings, plant life begins to grow around her, and rocks begin floating around. As for how the rocks are floating, I have no fucking idea, But the plant's growing as a neat little connection to Macross 7. I suppose she's just emitting some spiritua or something. Shin's stupid ass is so captivated by this, he just walks into the hot spring, not considering the fact she's naked, and it does lead to a wacky anime nudity joke, but thankfully it didn't linger on for too long. He asks how the rocks were floating, and she explains it's because the outsiders have brought along the Kadun of strife, which is now weakening the bond between the rocks and the earth. I don't know about you, but that makes perfect sense. I mean, what is Shin going on about calling them phony myths? Bro's probably a Santa denier too. While exploring more of the island, Ares finds a structure she recognizes from her old master, Dr. Hasford's journal. It turns out he was one of the first people to theorize about the existence of the protoculture, and he believes the Birdman to be a creation of them. However, once Sarah hears about the connection to Dr. Hasford, she orders Ares to leave the island at once. This is due to an encounter she had with him as a child, in which he offered her a pretty necklace and then forcefully snatched her blood while she was distracted. Wow, offering people some goods to get their blood. How familiar. Ares isn't even like, hey, are you okay? Do you got like an issue? No, she continues mocking Sarah, literally cutting herself in front of her, and then being like, ooh, there's something special about your blood, we want your blood. For being a cultural anthropologist, she sure isn't respectful towards a person from another culture. Justice for Sarah, bro, she's literally just trying to keep her people out of war. Anyways, as for what Ares does with the blood, she sends it to a lab where they compare it to blood found in the Birdman structure, discovering that they're identical. Mao sticks her finger in Shin's ass. I swear, dude, everyone in this OVA is a fucking psychopath. Anyways, she brings them to their awesome new TV they set up, where they're all watching Harold and the Purple Crayon. And then Mao takes Shin on a deep dive in the ocean to show off her special treasure. It's a chill scene. I like seeing their little underwater antics. And the special treasure she speaks of turns out to be none other than the Birdman's head the UN is searching for. Sarah's currently singing a song to resonate with her environment, but feels a disturbance after Mao kisses Shin. And no, it wasn't anything romantic. He was literally drowning and she had to give him mouth to mouth. Grow up. Ares was also recording Sarah because she's a fucking weirdo. And then Sarah, like, explicitly tells her that the white people gotta go. I am not joking, the subtitles directly name drop white people. Anyways, as they get back to the surface, Shin's alerted of the incoming anti-UN forces, who've broken into the base in an attempt to retrieve the Birdman's body. And apparently there's more coming to the island in order to find its head. Mao feels as if the anti-UN are the evil Cardoon the legend speaks of, and begs Shin to protect the bird head with everything he's got. This leads us into another great set of action sequences, where Roy fights on the surface against someone who's supposedly his old instructor, and Shin fights Nora in a very rare underwater fight. Although Shin successfully gets the bird head out of their grasp, the two end up colliding, crashing down into the surface below. And since Mao was in the plane, she retreats into an infantile state due to the immense trauma. Sarah begins panicking as the ongoing war might reawaken the Birdman, who will then sing the Song of Destruction that'll destroy all of humanity. But before she could do anything, the anti-UN forces begin blowing up the island, killing thousands of Mayans right before her eyes. This is a fucking tragic scene. We haven't seen something on this level since the Zentradi destroying Earth and SDF. It almost makes you forget that only one entry ago we were singing to Space Whales. But with the soundtrack, expression work, and just the whole sight of people being blown to smithereens, I don't even know what to say. What the fuck? Caught up in her despair, Sarah begins swinging a sword at Shin, demanding to know what he did with the bird head. But before he can explain much of anything, Nora ambushes them both, leaving us on a cliffhanger. Needless to say, I'm beginning to see Macross Zero's vision. Every Macross series has aimed to show the beauty of humanity and culture in the face of intergalactic threats. But this series goes to show that sometimes humanity's biggest threat can be humans themselves. While it's obviously not on such an extreme planetary scale, what the anti-UN did to the Mayans is no different from what the Zentradi did to the humans. And the UN isn't innocent either, they got the Mayans involved in all this. This series just feels so bleak, but before I can make a definite conclusion, let's actually finish the series. We got 2 episodes to go. Next episode starts off with Shin, Sarah, and Ares being held hostage by Nora and the anti-UN soldiers. In order to make him spit out the bird's head location, Nora beats Shin's ass, proclaiming that the UN is responsible for killing her mom and raping her sister. Which, yeah, like I said, the UN isn't innocent. But I do think there is an interesting dynamic at play here, as Shin's own family was killed by the anti-UN. They're in similar circumstances, just opposite sides. And it's something I really wish this OVA could have played more into, because outside of this scene, Nora really doesn't do anything. Anyways, soon enough, none other than Dr. Hasford himself arrives. And seeing him on the anti-UN side makes Ares be like, Dr. Hasford's a bad guy? Shut up, you're one step away from becoming a bad guy yourself. Anyways, he begins explaining his findings on the bird legend, saying that the Birdman was created by the protoculture to bring an end to humanity through the Song of Destruction, should they follow down the cycle of violence. However, the bird human rejected its duty, cutting off its head so it would never have to sing the song. However, every time humanity breaks out into conflict, the two halves get closer and closer, until they'll eventually refuse and destroy the entire world. He then proceeds to taunt Sarah by holding up the necklace, saying that this is all her doing. She's the one who guided him to the ruins, and she's the one who let her blood be taken. If that had never happened, the Birdman would have never become public knowledge. The island wouldn't have been dragged into this war. If you ignore the fact she was a literal naive child who got tricked, this is all indirectly her fault. Her feelings in this moment are so intense that she synchronizes with the Birdman, which has the ability to levitate the rocks around it. See, we did deduce a reason for the floating rocks. I'm so freaking smart. But this scene's fucking awesome. Shin uses the debris to free himself and then starts using one of the rocks like it's a Star Wars speeder. It's ridiculous, but it's awesome. I like it. Ares also gets saved by Roy. Yippee. Anyways, as Shin flies his rock off the cliff, Nora snipes them, leading us to a classic Macross fall. It's not that dire, they kind of fall on some trees and they're fine. Roy and Ares set up camp, where they have another well done moment of them reminiscing about their youth, and giving insight as to how they grew passionate about their careers. Their relationship in this series is so well done, it almost makes me forget how much I kinda hate Ares. It's okay, Roy, you can let her step on that landmine. They also kiss. Roy had hoes. Hoes he was pretty emotionally unavailable for, but hey, he had them. Still though, as nice as their relationship is, I think Sarah and Shin steal the show. Not only has Shin been the only one taking her feelings into account the entire OVA, but even after finding out about her mistakes, he tries consoling her by listing his dumb mistakes. You know, stuff like failing an exam, watching his comrades die before his very eyes, the usual. But seriously, I've made fun of Shin in the past for having a basic-ass design, and he does, but I do think he's a really likable character. This scene is freaking adorable, wholesome 100. It's a shame he falls off a cliff and dies. Just kidding, I totally got you. Sarah catches him and tells him that kids these days are too used to those damn light bulbs. All she needs is forest and the sea, unlike these bums who leave the island and never come back. For real though, I actually kind of feel bad for her in this scene. There is a part of her that wants to see progression within her society, but seeing how much strife such progression has brought on the outside world, it fills her with fear. She believes that keeping people in this bubble really is the only way of protecting them, and in a way she's not wrong. Societal development has led to more grand-scale conflict, but also How long can she stop the progression of those who strive for it? People like Mao do want to see change, they do want to evolve, but is it worth the risk? It's an interesting moral dilemma we've never really seen from this series, and it's part of the reason why I find Zero so interesting. Anyways, with Mao now in the UN base's hospital, the Mayans notice she's making slow progress, so they try doing a ritual to heal her instead. In response to the ritual, nature itself begins playing a song Sarah refers to as the Song of Life. This is genuinely my favorite scene of the entire OVA. The visuals of the glowing cicadas illuminating the forest, Sarah gently singing for those who are no longer able to sing, with Shin eventually joining in saying that he'll sing for her, before they kiss each other in front of the sunrise. It's a moment where I truly fell in love with Macross Zero. Sure, it's not a traditional Macross series, but it's still one that maintains the core essence. Modernized or traditional societies, peaceful times or war, nature will always persist, and that means there's always beauty to be had. And then the anti-UN drops massive fucking bombs everywhere. Good going, guys! I was only trying to do my corny Macross speech quota. Mao's awake though, so that's cool. Final episode. After bombing the island, the anti-UN forces have successfully captured not only Sarah and Ares, but the Birdhead as well. Mao uses her connection to the Birdman to reach Sarah and figure out what the anti-UN's plan is. And it's a classic JRPG villain plan. They want to use Sarah to harness the Birdman's power so they can destroy the world and create a new one in its wake. And in order to do so, they begin trying to manipulate Sarah into turning against the UN, with them trying to gaslight her into thinking everyone, including Shin, was just using her. And for a bit, it does begin to work. She does tap into the Birdman's energy, with the entire base levitating as a response. But she soon snaps out of it, and in an attempt to stop them from using the Birdman's power, she tries killing herself, which thankfully isn't successful. Here comes Shin to save the day. Never mind, his Valkyrie's head gets blasted off and he's crashing down below, thus leading Sarah to believe that he's dead. And this pain is the straw that breaks the camel's back, as she fully awakens, fusing with the Birdman to initiate the elusive Song of Destruction. Some rubble also lands on Dr. Hasford, which causes him to die, as he talks about how humanity sucks and whatnot. He will not be missed. As Birdman Sarah is destroying entire fleets with super lasers, the military decides the best course of action would be using reaction weaponry. You know, despite being actual nukes, Macross 7 has just conditioned me into seeing reaction weaponry as completely worthless. Nora and Roy's instructor are also killed by the Birdman, which we do not care. Roy goes to save Ares, and Shin makes his way directly to Sarah. Although, when approaching, he's filled with all sorts of horrific war flashbacks, adding another layer to this conflict. In this moment, he's scared, angry, and full of hate. Not only has this senseless war taken his family, his comrades, innocent lives, but now it's taken Sarah. She was the only person who gave him hope in this bleak period. She was someone who opened his eyes to the beauty of song, nature, the world. But he can't even have that, and that pisses him off. He can't bypass the projectiles and reach Sarah because his heart is too filled with hate. This is when Mao steps in. She somehow fucking astral projects a tiny version of herself into his Valkyrie to amp him up. I have no idea how she did this, but shoutouts to her. She reminds him that Sarah trusted him, she relied on him, and most importantly, she loved him. And that's what he needs to remember in this moment. He needs to remember love. And so he reflects, calms down, opens his heart, and charges straight in, not with violent intent, but with love. And it's love she feels as we get this beautiful scene of all her projectiles straying away from his Valkyrie. And the closer he gets, the more she snaps out of it until eventually she's free. She has let go of her own negative emotions, and now they get to love each other. Until the UN fires reaction weapons. Whenever there's trouble, it's always reaction weapons. So yes, before Sarah's nuked to oblivion, she pushes Shin away, where afterwards the bird human holding her folds off into the far reaches of the galaxy. Whether or not she survived is up to interpretation, cause trust me, this is the point where Kawamori became obsessed with open endings. Ares dies in Roy's arms from the earlier rubble, which is honestly a pretty sad scene, not because I cared much for Ares herself, but because it added another tragic layer onto Roy's character. It further contextualized his behavior in the original series, with his reluctance to become attached to Claudia. I'm still not the biggest Roy fanatic like many of you are, but this OVA definitely did help me appreciate him some more. I think he's cool. As for Shin, while crashing down, his controls shut down, leaving him to slowly plummet to the sea, as he reflects on how he failed to save Sarah. It's honestly a dismal scene. Not only did his voice actor knock it out of the park, but the audio design's especially good. There's no bombastic soundtrack or anything, just an eerie silence with nothing but rumbles from the crashing plane. But come on now, it's Macross, we can't end off on that side of a note. As he's crashing, he suddenly hears something. A song. The song not only of Sarah, but of the Mayan people as a whole. I'll say it again, Archon is a truly beautiful song, and it lends itself to the scene so well. The angelic vocals, the lighting of the ocean, the Valkyrie being lifted up from the song and ascending into space alongside Sarah, thus following the Birdman legend, with Mao even saying, "You really are a Birdman, Shin." It's a scene that's really something special. And upon further reflection, this OVA is pretty magical. There's no idols, no space setting, and no alien threat, but it somehow works. It still feels like Macross. My initial distaste came from how different it felt from the other series on the surface, but as I delved further into it, I realized something. This is not only a perfect follow-up to Dynamite 7, but it's the perfect evolution for Macross as a whole. Macross up until this point has mostly focused on the beauty of humanity and its culture. But Dynamite 7 began poking at something a bit deeper. With both the space whales and Basara's desire to see more of the galaxy, it seemed like Macross was beginning to spread its wings a bit, become less about the beauty of humanity and more about the beauty of the entire world itself. And this is something Zero doubled down on. It still had its humanity through the Mayan people, but it went so much deeper than that. The Mayans were deeply connected to nature. Sarah opened Shin's eyes to this. In the ending with the two ascending into space, with the camera slowly panning up, it tells us that beauty exists beyond humanity, beyond the earth itself. With great themes, likable characters, and top-notch presentation, I can finally say I get Macross Zero. And I regret ever clowning on it as hard as I did. It's still not my absolute favorite Macross, but it's a damn good one. I might even go as far as to say I enjoyed it more than Plus. I probably shouldn't have said that, but guys, we're doing Macross Frontier next. You all love that one.